So, picture this for a second. Imagine a massive national forest,
Yeah.
and it desperately needs restoration.
Right, like overgrown areas, crumbling logging roads, things that are serious fire hazards.
Exactly. And for once, everyone actually agrees on the blueprints.
Mm.
I mean, the environmentalists, the loggers, the local community, they are all completely on board with the design.
Which, honestly, in the world of forest management is practically a miracle on its own.
It really is. But here is the catch. The government permit office is entirely out of money. I mean, they have zero staff to review the paperwork, so absolutely nothing can move.
Yeah, you just hit a total administrative brick wall.
Right. So a local sawmill steps up. They offer millions of dollars of their own money to fund the science, hire the independent biologists, and push the paperwork through. And they do this completely at their own risk.
It sounds, incredibly pragmatic
Right.
until you ask the really critical question.
Which is,
Well, if the company paying the scientists only makes their money back if the forest gets logged, how can we possibly trust the science?
wow, yeah, that is the tension right there. Welcome to today's deep dive titled Episode 4, A to Z.
I am really excited for this one.
Me too. This is the legal and procedural episode of our series, and we are building it like a genuinely suspenseful procedural. We are diving in to a massive dossier about a landmark timber and restoration contract in the Colville National Forest.
And we have some incredible source material today. We are looking at federal court dockets, local reporting from the Spokesman Review over in Spokane, plus environmental assessments and agency fact sheets.
We really do have a lot of ground to cover, and for you listening, we are holding one central question open this entire time. A question we want you to weigh in on.
Exactly.
Can the party that stands to profit from the answer pay for the analysis?
It is a question that cuts right to the absolute heart of how our public lands are managed. And we're going to look at this calmly and measuredly because the paper trail is really where the true story lives.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to understand the systemic bottleneck that created this situation in the first place, right?
We do.
So we are starting in Washington State, on a Colville National Forest. The timeline is from the early 2000s into 2013. And as we hinted at, the Colville had achieved something incredible.
Right. They had forged a collaborative agreement. You had this remarkably diverse group of stakeholders, people who historically sued each other,
Yeah, the classic timber wars dynamic.
Exactly. But here, they're actually agreeing on a queue of necessary restoration work. They agreed on which specific areas were overgrown, which roads were bleeding sediment into the rivers, all of it.
But having an agreement is not the same thing as having permission. And here's the mechanism that trips everything up. The Colville National Forest had the community consensus, but they entirely lack the capacity to act on it.
Precisely. Because before a single chainsaw can start, right, or a backhoe can fix a road on federal land, the government has to comply with NEPA.
The National Environmental Policy Act.
Yes, NEPA.
Yeah.
And NEPA is not just a form you fill out in an afternoon. Every single acre of proposed work requires an exhaustive environmental assessment.
I mean, it's like having blueprints for a dream house in a neighborhood that totally loves the design. But the city permit office has no staff to actually review and approve the paperwork.
That is a perfect analogy. What's fascinating here is that producing that level of analysis, it requires federal employees and it requires an appropriated budget from Congress.
Right. You have to send biologists out to look for endangered species, hydrologists to measure the stream flows, soil scientists. It is rigorous.
And incredibly expensive. The forest simply lacked the staff and the money to write these documents, so consent had entirely outrun capacity. The collaborative agreement was free, but the legally required paperwork was decidedly not.
So the forest is stuck, just totally gridlocked. And this is where the agency decided to try a completely unprecedented fix.
This is where it gets wild.
On March 20th, 2013, the Forest Service posted a solicitation for something called the Mill Creek A to Z stewardship contract.
And the mechanics of this solicitation are what make it so unique. It was built around stewardship end result contracting, which is authorized under Title 16 U.S.C. Section 6591C, subsection B.
Okay, that is a lot of legal letters and numbers. Break that down for us.
Basically, normally, a stewardship contract works a bit like a barter system. The Forest Service tells a logging company, hey, if you perform this expensive restoration work for us, you can keep the commercial timber you remove as payment.
Ah, I see. So the value of the trees offsets the cost of the labor.
Exactly. But the Colville took that barter system and pushed it to an extreme new limit.
Right, because under this A to Z contract, The winner wouldn't just do the physical labor at the end. They would pay out of pocket, right up front, to hire the independent scientists to write the environmental assessment itself.
Hence the name A to Z. You fund the process from the very first scientific survey down to the last log on the truck.
And the sheer financial risk involved in this is staggering. There was exactly one sole bidder for this massive undertaking, Vaagen Brothers Lumber.
Yeah, a local mill with a deep vested interest in keeping the forest healthy and productive. They won the award in September 2013.
And this wasn't a small pilot project. This was a 10-year contract with a massive 54,000-acre analysis footprint.
54,000 acres. It's huge. And the ceiling was reported at up to $30 million.
Which means Vaagen Brothers had to assemble an entire shadow agency of private scientists and engineers to do the government's work.
They really did. They hired Kramer Fish Sciences to handle the rigorous environmental assessment, and then they brought on AKS Engineering alongside Northwest Management for the road design and the fish passages.
Now, when it comes to the actual money Vaagen Brothers spent on this upfront science, the sources give us conflicting financial figures, right?
Yeah, it varies depending on who you ask. Russ Vaagen stated the analysis alone cost more than $1 million. Other newspaper records cite the initial investment at over $2 million.
And then Curtis Vaagen put the ultimate figure at $4 to $5 million. But honestly, for you listening, the exact number doesn't matter nearly as much as the structural reality of how that money was spent.
Which is that every single dollar was spent before there was a decision from the government.
Let that sink in. There was no guarantee of approval, there was no guarantee of a final project, and there was absolutely no mechanism for reimbursement if the Forest Service ultimately read the science and said, no, we shouldn't log here.
That is the crux of the entire gamble.
Yeah.
The company fronts millions of dollars. The only way that money ever comes back to Vaagen Brothers is through the value of the timber removed at the end of the line.
If there is ultimately timber to remove.
Exactly.
Wait, let me stop you there, though. Because if the company paying the scientists only gets its money back through timber sales, how can the science possibly be objective?
And that is the exact tension that sparked a massive controversy.
I mean, if I'm a critic, I am looking at this and thinking the fix is in.
And we need to be very clear here. The critics of this project are serious people. They are raising serious structural concerns. They aren't just throwing around baseless accusations of personal corruption.
Right, let's steelman their argument. Jeff Juel of the Sierra Club looked at this and called the conflict of interest, quote, quite obvious.
And it is hard not to see his point. He argued that NEPA had essentially been sold to the only bidder. The timber company selects the scientific firm, sets the scope of the work, and pays the invoices.
How could that not influence the margins of error, you know?
That's exactly what Mike Garrity, the executive director of the Alliance for the Wild Rockies, pointed out. He said that simply having a timber company pay for the analysis calls the impartiality of that analysis into question.
Right. For Garrity, it isn't even about proving that the final environmental assessment is factually wrong. It's about the fact that the public can no longer implicitly trust it.
Exactly. The perception of bias destroys the utility of the document.
But if we're looking at the bigger picture, the most telling critic for me wasn't even an environmental advocate. It was Jim Furnish.
Oh, yes. The former deputy chief of the Forest Service.
Right. And Furnish is someone who broadly supports stewardship contracting. He actually wants these collaborative tools to work.
He really does. But even Furnish concluded that this specific A to Z arrangement crossed a fundamental line.
Because his standard was very simple. He said, quote, the premise needs to be unassailable.
And when the entity hoping to harvest the timber is writing the multi-million-dollar checks to the scientists evaluating the environmental impact, the premise is highly assailable.
Okay, let's unpack this from the other side. How does the Forest Service possibly defend this setup against such serious structural critiques?
The agency's defense hinges entirely on a concept called retaining the pen.
Retaining the pen.
Yeah. The Forest Service argued that the contractor, Kramer Fish Sciences, only wrote a draft. They collected the data, synthesized it, but they didn't sign anything binding.
Ah, I see. So the deciding official, the Forest Supervisor, retained all the required decision-making authority.
Exactly. They reviewed the drafts, made the final judgments, and signed the actual legal decisions.
And here's where it gets really interesting. The agency actually has a smoking gun to back this up.
They do, and it is a crucial piece of the timeline. Around October 2015, Forest Supervisor Rodney Smoldon actually withdrew a draft approval of the project.
He looked at what the contractor provided, decided it wasn't sufficient, and sent it back for rework.
And that detail is vital context for you to understand the agency's side. This is the absolute strongest evidence against the rubber stamp theory.
Totally. Because if a federal agency is truly captured, if they're simply doing whatever the paying contractor wants to get the project moving, they do not pull back their own draft approval.
Right. They wouldn't publicly delay the process and force the contractor to redo the work.
A rubber stamp does not reject the ink. So both sides here have incredibly powerful factual arguments.
They really do. The critics have the undeniable reality of the financial incentives, and the agency has the documented reality of retaining and exercising its executive authority.
But as we know, philosophical debates about incentives eventually hit the hard wall of the legal system. In 2016, the Alliance for the Wild Rockies took this exact issue to federal court.
Yeah, they sued in the Eastern District of Washington.
And it wasn't just the Forest Service standing alone to defend the project, which is fascinating. The intervener defendants included Stevens County, Penn-Doral County, and the Northeast Washington Forestry Coalition.
Right, essentially outside parties who joined the lawsuit to help defend the project. The local community went into federal court to defend this corporate-funded arrangement because they were that desperate to see the forest restored.
So let's track the timeline of how this courtroom sequence actually unfolded. The Alliance for the Wild Rockies initially moved for a preliminary injunction.
And let's clarify what that means for a second. A preliminary injunction is essentially an emergency brake.
Right. The plaintiffs were asking the judge to stop the chainsaws immediately while the lawsuit plays out, arguing that if the trees are cut down, the damage is permanent. You can't unlog a forest.
Precisely. But on October 19th, 2016, Judge Rosanna Malouf-Peterson denied that preliminary injunction.
And she famously stated that, quote, logging is not per se an irreparable harm.
That specific line traveled far and wide across environmental law circles. Naturally, the Alliance appealed that denial straight to the Ninth Circuit.
And the suspense builds. On August 1st, 2017, the Ninth Circuit affirmed the denial. They agreed with the lower court not to pull the emergency brake.
And this is where the narrative in the public sphere goes completely off the rails.
Yes, absolutely. There is a massive misconception we need to clear up right now. If you read the media coverage of this project from that time, almost everyone gets the aftermath of this ruling wrong.
So we are going to slow down here. We need to set the record straight on two vital legal corrections.
I'm going to say these slowly and out loud because this is the core of why this episode exists.
Okay, here's the reality of correction one. The Ninth Circuit affirmed the denial of a preliminary injunction, and they expressly did not reach the conflict of interest question.
Let me repeat that for you. They expressly did not reach the conflict of interest question. The court evaluated methodology claims regarding species viability and sediment in the rivers.
Right. But that fundamental central question we've been asking, whether a contractor-funded analysis violates the law, it was not resolved in that August 2017 opinion.
So if you read anywhere that the Ninth Circuit, quote, blessed, unquote, contractor-funded environmental analysis, it is entirely false. They didn't touch it.
That specific conflict of interest question wasn't decided until over a year later by the district court on October 4th, 2018.
And it was in that later ruling that the district court finally found that the objectivity and integrity of the NEPA process had not been compromised. But specifically on this particular record with these specific facts.
Exactly. Which brings us to correction 2, and this is just as important.
Correction 2. The physical project the Ninth Circuit reviewed was 12,802 acres. It was not 54,000 acres.
Right. 54,000 is just the massive contract footprint that always makes the headlines because it sounds so dramatic.
The actual project area under review in that specific court case was 12,802 acres. It is crucial to get these legal facts straight because they dictate exactly what precedent was and was not set for the rest of the country.
But all of this legal back and forth raises an enormous question.
It really does. So after all the millions of corporate dollars spent, the years of collaborative community meetings, and the intense federal court battles in Spokane, what did the physical forest actually get out of this?
Yeah, we've talked about procedure and injunctions, but what actually happened out in the dirt?
Right.
Well, to find out what was physically accomplished, we actually have to look away from the federal government entirely.
Wait, really?
Yeah. The most detailed public account of the physical restoration work comes from a subcontractor. It lives on AKS Engineering's own project page.
Okay, so what does their data say?
According to them, by 2023, 16 aquatic organism passage structures were designed and replaced. 3 barrier culverts were removed, roughly 1,200 linear feet of fish-bearing stream habitat was restored, and over a mile of mainline road was realigned.
Okay, I mean, those are real physical improvements.
Mm.
Replacing a barrier culvert might sound like a minor detail, but an incorrectly sized pipe under a logging road can act like a concrete wall to migrating fish.
Oh, absolutely. Fixing those reconnects miles of isolated habitat.
But there is a glaring, massive blind spot here. Where is the Forest Service's data?
That is the void at the center of this entire story. There is no published road decommissioning mileage. There is no total for acres thinned. And most surprisingly, there is no dedicated monitoring report from the Forest Service itself.
Nothing.
Nothing. The agency published a flagship fact sheet titled Innovation Underway, A to Z, and that document contains 0 output metrics.
Wow. That absence is itself a finding. Let me say that plainly to you. A project that was rigorously defended in federal court as a bold national model has, after a decade, no published monitoring results by the party that ran it.
It is genuinely hard to believe.
We simply cannot answer from the public record if this unprecedented procedural experiment actually produced more restoration than the ordinary process would have. We know the culverts are in the ground because the engineers told us, but the comprehensive data from the agency just isn't there.
Which naturally leads us to look at the legacy of this model. When this A to Z contract was first signed, it was predicted to be a template.
Right. People thought this model would spread across the country to unlock other gridlocked national forests.
Exactly.
So did it instead?
It did not. The A to Z model stayed entirely isolated on the Colville National Forest. There was a second project attempted, known as Juel A to Z. It had a bid deadline of March 6th, 2020. And covered roughly 58,375 acres.
But the design of that second project quietly changed, didn't it?
It did. The Juel project was fundamentally restructured. Instead of the sweeping, decentralized authority granted in the Mill Creek contract, contracting oversight for Juel was pulled back closer to home.
Ah, I see.
Yeah, it was held directly at the forest level, unlike Mill Creek. And if you look at the reporting across the country, there is no A to Z style contract on any other national forest.
So it was a 2-project experiment on one single forest. It was successfully defended in court based on its own highly specific facts, but its structure was modified the very second time it was attempted.
Right. It never became the national template it was envisioned to be.
So we circle back to the central question we've held open this entire time. Can the party that stands to profit from the answer pay for the analysis?
The documentary reality provides a very measured, complex answer. A district judge said yes for this specific project on this specific factual record.
The Ninth Circuit, despite what all the headlines say, said nothing about it at all.
And Jim Furnish, the former deputy chief who desperately wanted these models to succeed, said the premise needed to be unassailable, and it was assailed.
It leaves you with something profound to mull over as we wrap up. Consider what it means for the future of our public lands when the most novel procurement experiment in modern history is left without a public monitoring report.
It's a sobering thought.
We legally validated a process, but we entirely forgot to measure the physical results it left in the dirt.
A lot to think about.
Like and subscribe, it really helps the channel reach others.